It has become abundantly clear now in the fifth year, and now the first set of rankings in the fifth year, that this system, regardless of who's on the committee, this system of ranking teams by the College Football Playoff Committee is the most flawed way we can possibly rank college football teams. There's really one giant reason why just 13 people in a room is the most flawed way to rank college football teams, and that comes down to variance. Statistical variance. What you're going to have is one or two rogue votes, and depending on how influential they are, they end up grabbing even more, 2, 3, 4, 5 votes, end up swaying wildly out of the data set and out of the norm, and that affects the rankings. And these rankings matter, so you can no longer tell me that they don't matter like the AP poll. You can no longer tell me any of that because, one, they affect directly who is included in the playoff, and these are the rankings that we are absolutely hiring and firing coaches by when it comes to the offseason. Resumes are built, so everything matters, not just 1 to 4, but 5 to 25. It matters where teams are, and it matters what you're doing with that resume in the back end of the rankings. Now, it's pretty clear that the variance right now is skewing wildly in one direction, and let's get to those numbers. This committee, as it's currently constructed, has two major flaws. One is their confirmation bias, and it's pretty clear that they have it, and the other is there's clearly an influencer on that committee right now that is driving a data set that is not anywhere close to what it should be. It's way outside of the margin for error. And so let's dive into that. First, the confirmation bias. We have heard for years and years and years, and rightly so because of the top end of the league, that the SEC is the end-all be-all in college football. And that's true at the top end of their conference. They've been terrific. They've won so many national titles. They've been dominant. Alabama is currently on a stretch in which I would call them the most dominant and best college football team maybe ever, in particular when you're talking about the entire decade since they won their first championship. I think Nick Saban's the best coach that we've ever seen. Now, what that has done is it has skewed the vision a little bit of what happens under Alabama. The SEC is pretty good, and this year they're having a better year than they did a year ago, in particular when you're talking about record against other Power 5 leagues. Now, they're not quite good enough for this to be true about these first rankings. The top undefeated team was an SEC team, Alabama. The top one-loss team ranked in the rankings was LSU, and by the way, they were over and undefeated in Notre Dame. The top two-loss team was Florida. They were ranked ahead of a one-loss West Virginia, ahead of an undefeated Central Florida. The top three-loss team in the rankings, Mississippi State, ahead of some two-loss and even one-loss teams deep in the rankings back there in the back end. So that's confirmation bias at play. Every single time they have a chance to rank someone higher than they maybe should be, it happens for the SEC, and they get the benefit of the doubt. You could argue that they've earned it. I would argue that it's confirmation bias. Let's get to the actual problem with this current committee, because there's clearly an influencer, and I happen to believe it's Frank Beamer out of the ACC, the former head coach at Virginia Tech, and what a great head coach he was. Frank Beamer is one of the all-time greats. I love watching Frank Beamer teams play. But it's pretty clear that he's got the ear of the committee. How do I know that? The conference he coached in was overvalued by such a staggering margin that it's hard to even fathom the numbers that I'm about to talk about. First and foremost, you've got to understand that I value, and a lot of people value, computer rankings. And if you look at enough computer rankings, what you get is a data set that has so many variations and so many variables that you start to throw out the anomalies, and you start to get to a data set that is very standard and standardized. And you start to see that there's not a lot of margin for error, and there's not a lot of deviation from that norm. So if you look at the FPI and the Sagarin ratings, let's just take those two for example, what you see is, generally speaking, those two will kind of line up with each other. And they're not exactly, but like I said, within the margin of error for the most part. So if you take the FPI and the Sagarin ratings and you look at where some of these ACC teams are ranked in those systems, what you see is that they are far below that 25 mark, that it automatically should pique your interest. You should start to go look at the data. And what does the data suggest? Well, it suggests this. The ACC is so far overvalued that it is staggering by a mark of, on average, 16 3/4 spots. Those four teams, Syracuse, North Carolina State, Boston College, and Virginia are on average, not total, on average ranked 16 and 3/4 spots higher by the committee than they are in the FPI. What about the Sagarin ratings? 16 full spots higher in the rankings than they are in the Sagarin ratings. That is a staggering data set. Every other conference that you look at, and I have looked at all of them, fall within the margin of error, between 3.5 each direction. Some are higher, some are lower. Now, we're going to get into one conference that actually is bearing the brunt of this fraudulent data system, this fraudulent rankings, and this influencer in the committee, because right now the ACC is putting their thumb on the Big Ten. The Big Ten is bearing the brunt of these flawed rankings. And the reason I know that is because every other Power 5 league is actually ranked higher by the committee, on average, all of their teams, than the computer rankings, the FPI and the Sagarin, all of them, okay? There's only one Power 5 league that on average their ranked teams are lower, and that's the Big Ten. They're lower by about 3.25 spots. Now you could say that's the margin of error, but I want to take another step. That's without teams like Michigan State, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Northwestern even ranked. Okay, so that's not even allowing for the option that these teams are so far below what they should be by the committee, and they're not even in that data set. So that's just taking the Big Ten teams that are ranked. They're 3.25 spots lower on average in the committee rankings than they are in the computer rankings. That's wrong. That's wrong. If you did just a direct comparison between the 4 ACC teams that are ranked, so Syracuse, North Carolina State, Boston College, and Virginia, and you did a direct comparison to Wisconsin, Purdue, Michigan State, and Northwestern, what you will see is that the top 3 on that Big Ten list, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Michigan State, are all to a team ranked higher in every computer poll than any of those ACC teams. And when you look at Northwestern, they're ranked higher than Virginia in every one of those computer polls. The Big Ten is bearing the brunt of this flawed system this year. Then you just dig a little bit deeper and you'll see that there's no reason for this whatsoever. It's not like the ACC has been great in the non-conference. In fact, they've got the worst record of any other Power 5 league against the other Power 5 leagues, including Notre Dame, of anybody in the country. They're 3-9 in those games. There's only 2 leagues that have a winning record in such games against Power 5 leagues, including Notre Dame. The SEC, which has the top record in the country, and the Big Ten. The Big Ten is 7-6. Even when you look at the Big Ten versus specifically the ACC, what you'll see is the Big Ten is 3-1 in those matchups. The only loss that they suffered was Duke beating Northwestern. And every other matchup, you saw Purdue beat Boston College. Boston College is now ranked. For what reason, I don't know. You saw Indiana beat Virginia. Indiana beat Virginia. Why is Virginia ranked? There's no reason whatsoever. You saw Penn State beat Pitt 51-6. 51-6 out of the ACC. There's no reason for these numbers to come out the way that they are except for 2 very clear reasons: confirmation bias and influential bias in the committee. This is the most flawed way we can possibly rank college football teams, and it's that flawed by a wide margin.